evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you very much for getting up so early and making all the way here to this very special, significant event. And today, I think we try to have a very relaxing kind of setup. And thank you very much for NTUP, the staff, for this arrangement, and also a lot of Kathy. This is basically co-hosted by the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures and the National Taiwan University Press. And with the kind of collaboration, I think they really facilitated all this a lot of tedious work. And so hopefully today this event will generate a lot of all these rewarding feedbacks. And today we actually have three special guests and speakers. The first one is my good old friend Alan Miller, from the Vice Provost from the University, USC, but not Southern California, it's South Carolina. And Alan is a specialist in classic literature, but I wouldn't categorize him as a classic scholar, because his fields of research actually encompass a lot, from Foucault to from Plato to Foucault to modern theories, this and that. And I first met Alan when I was in the Office of International Affairs with this kind of humanities kind of research. And over the years, we are very, very happy that Alan and the USC has become a very important and dear partner to NTU, and especially in the humanities studies. I think we feel like we are pretty much marginalized, as humanities scholars. But Alan has been, endeavoring to promote all this cross interdisciplinary studies. So today's event is not simply just about our book launch, but also about his take on the new directions of humanities studies and new modes of knowledge production. And then our second speaker, another interlocutor to Alan, after Alan's talk, is Professor Sebastian Liao, also a very dear colleague in my department. And Professor Liao is currently the Dean of the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences at NTU. So a very important position, also launching and promoting humanities studies. And today we are really honored to have these two experts. One, it's on my way I was thinking this is a perfect compliment, because Alan researches on Plato, the Western classics, but with the Asian or Eastern kind of approach. And Professor Liao's research is from Hong Meng, to Anglo-American poetry to globalization, and so his approach is pretty much with this a Western paradigm. So I think their dialogue probably will generate a lot of sparks. And also our fourth guest speaker is Professor Zhang Junze, the professor of entomology, and he's the associate director of National Taiwan University Press. And thanks to NTUP, I think the co-publishing between USCP and NTUP was made possible. So we actually really thank these speakers. And without further ado, I won't get the talk delayed. And so in principle, Alan will give his talk for about 20 minutes, 20 to 30. And then after that, there will be this dialogue between Professor Liao and Alan. And after that, we'll open the floor to the audience for questions. And I'm sure it's going to be a very, very rewarding feast. And first of all, I would like to invite Professor Zhang to give some welcome remarks.
feel a bit nervous because this is maybe the first time I speak with the scholars from different disciplines in a meeting. So I have to say good morning, Professor Miller, Professor Liao, and Professor Fu. Ladies and gentlemen, according to Taiwanese and also international etiquette, I have to say, please allow me to introduce myself. I am Junzhe Zhang, the Associate Director from the National Taiwan University Press and a professor affiliated to the Department of Entomology. And it is my great honor to welcome all of you here and on behalf of Director Wang Taisheng and my colleagues in the NTU Press. And my colleagues and I are so delighted to participate in the book launch of Digitalizing the Global Text, Philosophy, Literature and Culture. And this new book is also the first volume of East-West Cultural Encounters in Literature and Cultural Studies series. And I think this is a milestone moment for the University of South Carolina Press and the NTU Press. And the book entitled Digitalizing the Global Text, Philosophy, Literature, and Culture, I think is not only the first volume of the series, but also the very first volume published through the cooperation between these two university presses. And thanks for the great efforts from Professor Miller and Professor Fu and Professor Liao, and plus co-workers of the book series. Okay, I think now I feel a bit relaxed. So I have to talk, on my words. So as you know, I am a developmental biologist. I am studying how genes regulate the development of germ cells in insects. So simply speaking, I'm studying bug's life. Okay. And so apparently, and to be honest, I know very little about what the book says. But when I first received the copy of this book, I feel so deeply impacted by the cover of this book. But not only because of the very attractive and modern title of this book, but also the pictures on this book. So the digital code on the cover, and to me, just made me think about, it looks like the genetic codes to me, because the digital codes, the combination of the endless forms of combination of the digital codes, and forms the new aspects of philosophy, literature, and culture. Just like genetic codes, the combination of genetic codes forms all of the lives in the world. And when I open the book, I think one title in particular attracted me. The title says Local Cultures, Global Audience. And the title very much hits my heart because it just describes how we do in the experiment and how we publish. Because in the digital era, we can study the local species in Taiwan, and then we can publish what we study in Taiwan globally. So I think this is very much similar to the spirit of this book, digitalizing the global text through different aspects. So here, please allow me to thank Professor Miller and Professor Liao, Professor Fu, and all of the co-workers of the book. And we very much look forward to the continuation of the collaboration in the future in between the University of South Carolina Press and the NTU Press. And I think I would like to hand over my microphone to Professor Fu, and I think I would like to start here. And thank you very much for all your coming. Thank you very much.
So thank Thank you, Professor Zhang. I think like you were, what you mentioned like about the digital codes and the genetic codes, and the connection, I also pretty much like hit the core. And I think like this is a very good introduction to sort of like an interdisciplinary and international studies. So like now I'll hand the microphone to Alan, and Alan will be probably like sitting, and then just please welcome Alan for his talk.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Professor Fu, Professor Liao, Professor Chang. It's a great honor. This is a very exciting moment, certainly for the University of South Carolina. We see this joint publication as a real opportunity for us to reach new audiences, to bring in new thoughts, and we hope that NTU Press sees it the same way. I think both of us are becoming global university presses through this series, and that's important. What I want to do is I want to keep this fairly informal. I didn't want to come and read a paper to y'all. I want to talk a little bit about the book and the series briefly, and then I want to talk about the moment in globalization that really led to the creation of this book, because it happened at a very interesting time. This came out of a conference that was held here originally in 2016, I believe. Then I will talk a little bit about where I see global humanities going in the future. But you'll see here that, up on the screen we have the call for manuscripts and really what the series is trying to do. So we want this series to be comparative. We're really looking at books that put Asian culture and Western culture in dialogue with each other. And I think that's very important. We're not looking simply for a monograph about an individual author, be that a Western author or an Asian author. We're looking for something conceptually larger, something with some theoretical depth, but also one that is truly global. And there are a list of topics here, and you can read them. I don't need to read them for you. But now I see many young scholars and a few of us older scholars in the audience. And I hope you'll consider submitting manuscripts. We are looking for exciting monographs as well as collections of essays, we would welcome the opportunity to look at your work. There we go. So. It is a nice cover, I have to say. I was very happy with the design team. This book came together with representatives from 3 universities. So the University of South Carolina, NTU, and EWA. We were really coming together to talk about topics of globalism, but also digital humanities, and trying to think what the nexus is between digitality, the process of digitalization, and how that's related to globalization. And really what I want to argue in my piece is that there is an inherent connection between the two. The way the world becomes global is through digitalization. And that's both a good thing, a potentially good thing. It allows, as Professor Chang said, our research to go around the world, but it also has a kind of flattening effect, creating what in many ways is a global culture that can feel sometimes stifling, right? One goes everywhere and one sees McDonald's, You go to the malls in Taichung, you go to the malls in Dubai, you go to the malls in Columbia, South Carolina, where I live, and you see the same stores with the same products. And so there's also something about globalization that is somewhat threatening. And actually, one of the things I like about the cover is it captures both of these. On the one hand, there is this notion that there is, there's this hand out, and is that hand receiving the globalization, or is this a more threatening gesture as the zeros and ones tend to create a kind of uniform culture across the globe? And we've seen a lot of reaction to that in recent years. So, here you see, this is the actual table of contents. And you'll see that we have a number of perspectives here. As my colleague Julie Choi from Ewha said, she's pretty sure this is the only book that she's ever seen and will ever see that has both Gundam style and Plato in it. We try to be pretty comprehensive, but one of the things that we're really thinking about here is how does the global allow for the individual, the particular, in my title, the queer? I'm particularly interested in that as a classicist. So there's a little joke in my title on being old and queer. On the one hand, classic literature is both old and frequently considered unusual, particular, queer in the classic English usage. But also, one finds as one grows older and gets a lot of gray hair, and you're interested in unusual things, that you are increasingly old and queer. So, how you think about that, though, in the context of a global world, and whether there's still room for that in the context of a global world and global universities, is what these papers are all about, And in a way, Gundam style is really important to think about there, because here you have this piece of very local culture that went absolutely global. The YouTube video has been viewed millions and millions of times. So, on the one hand, when we first started writing the book, we were all convinced that, the future is global. And there were a number of reasons to believe that. The rise of the neoliberal model, this is the model of global capitalism. It is a model that says that we value things according to whether they can be quantified, whether they can be digitalized, whether they can be commodified. It is a culture that sees efficacy in terms of what is reproducible. And it by and large lets markets that, those kinds of determinations of value determine what we value as a whole. And this has been spreading across the globe. This is true today in Beijing, as it is in San Francisco, as it is in Taipei, as it is in Cape Town. So, and many of us felt that there was a great deal of confidence in this. Francis Fukuyama, at the end of the 1980s, was writing about the end of history as, capitalism and liberal politics were taking over the world. In many ways, this happened at the end of the Cold War, because there was the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the traditional Chinese communist model, and it seemed like we were moving more or less towards one system. There was a grooming of an international technocratic elite. If you think about, just in the way people dressed and presented themselves and talked about things, there was almost a kind of interchangeability between the people who were in the Clinton administration or the Obama administration, or for that matter, the Bush administration, and the people who were leading France, or Hu Jintao. They were, there was a kind of uniform, there was a kind of discourse about value, and there were certainly local differences. But there was this sort of general consensus that you would find in places like the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF. And in many ways, this was made possible because of U.S. hegemony. The U.S. was the global leader in this, in terms of talking about free trade, in terms of linking free trade with certain governmental norms, in terms of allowing cultural flow. And this, was powered by, ultimately, the digitalization of capital. If you think about the reach of something like Amazon or Disney, or FedEx, these are all information-driven systems that at the same time are able to spread products and services around the world. But with 2008 and the economic collapse and the beginning of the Great Recession there, a lot of people begin to question the neoliberal model. There's a great deal, there's been a huge rise in inequality during this same period. You see, just in recent weeks, you've seen protests, in Bolivia, in Chile, throughout Europe, in Iran, obviously in Hong Kong. Many of these are political, but there's often an economic base, there's often growing inequality in all these places. At the same time, there's been a real increase in the return to nationalism. Think America first, our president's slogan. You see this in Hungary, you see this in China and its greater national assertiveness. You see this in Brexit. So and these are forces that push very strongly against globalism. There has been a rise globally in racism. We certainly see this in the United States, but you see it in the reaction against refugees in Europe. You see it in places like Myanmar with the Rohingyas. So, while on the one hand there has been this dynamic towards globalization and towards a kind of flattening, and yet there is simultaneously, and economic forces are often driving this too, been a reassertion of local particularity, sometimes in positive ways, but sometimes in very negative ways. And this has been accompanied by, what is in some ways a withdrawal of the U.S. from the world stage. Certainly the U.S. is still a very powerful country, and certainly people pay attention, but we are not articulating a vision for the world right now. In fact, what we are saying is every country should look out for itself. We're telling the South Koreans that they need to pay more if our troops are going to be there. We're arguing with France on TV about tariffs. So the notion that there is a unified system and that somehow the U.S. oversees all this or is a model for this is fading. And lastly, I argue in the book, and I would argue here, this is in some ways the double nature of the biopolitical state. Biopolitical state is a concept that was first elaborated by Michel Foucault, and it really says that around the end of the 18th century, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit, there is a turn towards seeing the state as something that positively is supposed to foster life. Bio and politics, right? And so, you start seeing the growth of public health initiatives. You start seeing the growth of demographics as a science. You start seeing states believing that they should, manage populations. And this has many good effects because you start thinking that, you know, okay, the job of the state is actually to make sure that people are healthy and well-fed, etc. But at the same time, if my job is to preserve my population and your population is seen as a threat to mine, then your population is an enemy and something has to be done about that. So Foucault argues that it's no coincidence that we see the rise of racism and genocide at the same time that we see the rise in the biopolitical. The logic behind both are the same. And so we see that sort of double logic in this move towards globalization, but also in this reaction against it. In the end, though, I want to argue that globalization is inescapable. In part, it's just the economy. Supply chains, flows of information, human capital cannot be limited to a single country anymore. So I come from South Carolina. It's a little tiny state, 4 million people. Has the largest foreign direct investment of any state in the entire United States. When you think of, you know, the United States and you think of the world economy, you think New York, you think San Francisco, you think Los Angeles. You don't necessarily think Spartanburg, South Carolina. You've probably never heard of Spartanburg, South Carolina. But every BMW sport utility vehicle in the world is made in Spartanburg, South Carolina. So if you drive one in Beijing, if you drive one in Taipei, if you drive one in Cape Town, it was made in South Carolina. All the parts that make that come in from all over the world through the port of Charleston. They're assembled and then they come out. So we don't make all the parts there. So we not only ship all over the world, we receive from all over the world. And this is a tiny little place in an out-of-the-way area, but it is a hub of global capital. You can't turn that off. We're not all of a sudden going to go back to only manufacturing things within our own borders. It's too late. The environmental crisis knows no borders. You know, climate change, particularly in a place like Taiwan, you know, y'all live real close to the ocean. Seawaters are rising. It's impossible for us to talk about this in a national context. Climate change is a global problem and has to be dealt with it. When you talk about global health challenges, whether you're talking about AIDS or you're talking about Ebola, in our world today, again, these have to have a global response. Information is global. So, and I want to make sure I'm not going on too long.
No worries.
So, what then, how should we as humanists respond to this sort of quandary? On the one hand, we see the rise of globalism, we see it's inescapable. On the other hand, we see the reaction against it and its limitations. So I want to argue that in the humanities, the first thing, we have to have a theoretical perspective. You have to be, in the age of globalism, the study of culture and literature requires a self-conscious theoretical perspective. You can't simply say, I'm going to respond to my little tradition in my own very traditional way. We have to be talking to each other, and to be talking to each other, we can't simply assert our own traditional verities. We have to have a larger perspective. I think one of the things we see, particularly as tendencies in the humanities, and particularly in comparative literature, which is where my PhD is, you know, the growth of East-West comparison. There are many comparative literature programs in the United States today that focus almost exclusively on comparison between Eastern literatures and Western literatures. So, and this is in part because there's been an increasing decentering of the Western canon. So in the 1960s, if you went to, say, Yale and you got a PhD in comparative literature, you had to know French, German, Latin, and Greek. Chinese? Spanish even? You know, If you have time, you know. Literature was defined as, you know, mainstream Western classical literature. Hey, I'm a guy who does French, Latin, and Greek, so, you know. Parallel to this, you know, is the rise of China and Chinese studies. I don't think that can be underestimated, you know. It is impossible to ignore the importance of China and Chinese culture today. And, you know, with that has grown, you know, large fields of study. And so how we articulate the relationship between these bodies of literature has become increasingly important. You know, and there have been increasing interchanges between Chinese and Western scholars from 1980s to the present. So all that has really been fueling this growth of, you know, literary comparison from an increasingly global perspective. Another thing I would say about comparative literature today and the kind of perspectives that, you know, we're trying to bring in this series is we need to both demystify theory and promote theoretical reflection. We need to ask why. Why are we doing things that we do? Why do certain traditions configure themselves the way they do? And those are theoretical questions. The why questions are always theoretical questions. But we need to recognize that we always have in a certain sense. So, you know, one of the things I hear is, you know, are you for theory or are you against theory? And I want to say that that's a silly question. That everybody has theoretical assumptions. Everybody assumes that they know what their object of study is, that they have defined it in a certain way. And the only question then is, are you open to questioning those assumptions, you know? So, you know, you can either say I don't have a theory because I have the truth, and so I don't need to interrogate my assumptions. Or you can say, no, I'm open to interrogating those assumptions, and I want to encounter people from other traditions who have different assumptions, and then we can have a theoretical dialogue. And in that perspective, theory has sort of always existed, you know, as long as people have asked those why questions. We need to promote transnational literary study as an antidote both to an unprincipled neoliberalism, a neoliberalism that says the only thing that can be of value is what can be turned into a commodity, what can be sold. But also as an aid to mutual understanding. You know, it's very important in the world today where we are forcibly globalized, but where people are also reacting against that in some very harsh ways, to understand that there are ways for people to interact and to appreciate each other that don't have to reduce it all to a single common denominator. That don't have to reduce it to a single sort of monetized global culture in which everybody watches Disney, everybody reads the top 10 books on the Amazon bestseller list, you know. So I'm going to finish up then and say, you know, why comparative literature? So I've been working on an idea. It's not very well articulated, but I'm going to trot it out here and see what people think. I've spent a lot of time the last 6 years traveling the world as the representative of the University of South Carolina. And I've come increasingly to believe that the world is more or less organized around about 4 basic civilizations. And I know this is a gross oversimplification, but the West, I would argue, has an essentially Platonic model of knowledge. Our concepts of justice, our concepts of rights, but are also concepts of the way subjects interact with objects can be derived from Plato and various refinements of that philosophical tradition. I find that when I am in Asia, people think about things and relate to the world in very different ways than that Platonic model. The Confucian model is one that doesn't privilege a certain kind of subjective autonomy that sees itself as alienated from the world in the way the Platonic model does. And consequently, there are a whole series of different references. The way poetry is articulated is different. The way music's understood is different. And you start to see that, you know, you're talking to people when I come who have a fundamentally different view of the world. And trying to understand that, trying to come to terms with that is both liberating for me and my colleagues, you know, but it's also important for understanding how we're going to come to meet these global challenges. I find the same thing when I'm in the Middle East, except it's a Koranic world. You know, again, the kind of references that just everybody assumes, the kind of assumptions about spiritual life, about aesthetics, they're remarkably similar throughout the area. It's not to say people don't have disagreements, there are intense agreements, but there's a framework of understanding that people operate within that, again, is very different from what you would normally find in Western Europe, but it's very different from what you would find here as well. And I posit of the Vedantic world because it seems to me that the Indian subcontinent works in a slightly different way. So now I know I'm grossly overgeneralizing, but I think if there's some kernel of truth in what I'm arguing, then really understanding how cultures work and how global cultures work is going to involve understanding these basic fields of reference that different peoples operate in. And often people learn to operate simultaneously in more than one, you know, and I think we see that a lot today. But I think comparative literature and something like our series has a lot to offer in understanding that. And so I think, you know, I'm going to close then that what I'm hoping we can do in comparative humanities and global humanities, what we can do in this series is, you know, really promote the simultaneous necessity of recognition and self-estrangement in the face of planetary peril. And what I mean by recognition is understanding who we are, recognizing others, but also self-estrangement. For us to really understand each other, we also have to be able to take a step back from ourselves. You know, and encountering other traditions and then trying to theorize them, trying to make sense of them is an inherent part of that is this taking a step back from your own natural perspective and realizing it is only one of many. And I think I'll stop at that.
Thank you very much, Professor Miller. Usually I'm used to calling you. This is quite interesting because actually Alan's brief talk reminds us of certain changing contours of epistemology and knowledge production in the humanities. And I was like looking around. I got several personal, maybe like certain collective reflections. I think like we here, the so-called like Western literature scholars, I think in a way we are all like doing comparative literature. Like I'm doing Asian American, Canadian, French Canadian, you know, English Canadian. Alan is doing like Plato theories, Foucault, and Professor Liao is doing at the same time Anglo-American poetry, and we also recently like we have two visiting professors at NTU, Professor Wu Song Kang from Seoul National. He's like here to study Hou Xiaoxian's films. So like, but he's like in the English department. And we have Professor Ri from Hanyang University. His specialization is Yeats studies, but over the past 20 years, it's been, you know, doing this like a Yeats conference every year with Yeats in dialogue with the East, or like in Yeats and arts, etc. So in a way, we sort of like, we are all like doing comparative literature without even knowing it. And as Alan has said, like, are you for or like against theory. Yes, we all have our theoretical assumptions, and we actually, just like we are not aware of that. But I think, so this reminder is pretty significant, like for us to know, okay, like these are the directions that we are taking. And also, have you noticed, we are sitting at a very symbolic site. This building is Dongdongban, right? And it was to be demolished, but that kept us this, like, I don't know, heritage site. But now with the renovations, so it used to be the building of anthropology, and the anthropology people like now are, kicked, outside of the campus. Hopefully they are coming soon. But at the same time, next to us, I want to point that out. This is like the new humanities building under construction. So we are actually sitting at a very symbolic site between the old and the new. And this new, like after so many years of a struggle, I was talking to Ellen, finally we claimed a little space. And this space then, in the humanities, then gives us a certain kind of identity. So I think like when we do humanities studies for science people, like I think like they get a lot of land, it's like free, or like people just like provide free buildings, this and that. For us, it's not easy. So I do believe what we are doing is still pretty important, and it has like this invisible but significant impact on the next generations and kind of academic research in general. So I'll hand this now for the second phase. Professor Liao and Alan will, just have a
dialogue.
Symposium. Plato's dialogue.
Sorry.
Alan, so.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, for your brief but very rich remarks. It's not only enlightening, I could almost say that it's visionary. Yeah. And you were, in your remarks, you criticized the American leadership now for lacking vision. And so, actually, I'd really like to urge you to join the presidential campaign. Run for president, so that we can have a, president of the United States with a vision. Okay. Because the world is really going down the drain. All right. I'd like to begin with just a very well-known story, The Garden of Forking Paths by Borges. This story, I guess you're all very well acquainted with. It's about actually a Chinese English professor of English, like me, who knows the West and is very smart, but he's forced to become a German secret agent, trying to secure information for the German Reich. And he's so smart, but in the end he just has to kill this British sinologist because he wants to prove to the Germans that I am human too, I'm as good as you are. But why does he have to prove to the Germans that he's human? Because, colonialism. He's totally brainwashed by colonialism. So for him, at the moment when he's trying to shoot this British sinologist, right before that, he says, because the British sinologist told him that there are various kinds of alternative futures. But for him, the future already exists. Bang! For him, he's not able to envision an alternative future. And that's the problem. And I think right now, many of us, I would say most of them, many of us simply cannot imagine an alternative future other than this neoliberal order. Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah. So, I think people like Walter Mignone or people like you guys are trying to offer us a vision of an alternative possibility, or many alternate possibilities. For instance, Walter Mignolo, famously posited this two kinds of different cosmopolitans. One is critical, and the other is a kind of neoliberal. And we should opt for this critical, but it is, of course, very difficult. And some years ago, he was here to give a talk, and he was actually, when people, of course, in the crowd, you always get questions like, China and this, China and that. So they want to start a China bashing thing. And Walter Mignolo was kind of hesitant to wholesalely condemning China on that occasion. And I could understand why, I can understand why, because 2 years ago I wrote a short essay about the God without Satan. When you have a God without Satan, then the world will become a disaster. Just like right now, there's the God, Trump. Without, for instance, Russia or China, he's going to have to wait. Even at the time of Obama, you see this Snowden affair. I was really scared by the situation, because even people like Obama, who look so genteel, humane, was actually engaged in kind of a global surveillance of everybody, including Merkel. And so if there was no Russia, then Snowden would have long been, imprisoned. Even China did not have the guts to take Snowden. Right? So, it takes me back to William Blake, who was trying to reinterpret Milton's Paradise Lost. Or people, late after him in that whole period, starting from him until the 19th century. So many people are trying to see Satan as this Promethean figure which brings fire to the world. So we can never, criticize too hastily the Satan figures, because without Satan's, God's just going to have his really bad way. And I think one of the reasons, or maybe one of the major reasons, that we are not able to see the inevitable triumph of the neoliberal order was because we haven't been interrogating modernity thoroughly enough. Not thoroughly enough. We have been criticizing modernity, interrogating modernity, but not enough. Or let's say not nearly enough, because you see the rise of the right. You see the kind of a revisionist historiography promoted by the Japanese, becoming sort of universalized in Asian countries. First in Taiwan, there's this glorification of Japanese colonization by means of saying that, the Japanese build infrastructure in Taiwan, the infrastructure foundation in Taiwan and all that. They forgot that the Japanese did it for themselves, not for us. And we used to think that the Koreans were very, very anti-Japanese, anti-colonial and all that. But in fact, some years ago, 20 years ago, I ran into this Korean scholar, critical Korean scholar, who says that no, actually, the revisionist historiography was on the rise in Korea too, because the right-wing Korean politicians are predominantly either collaborators of the Japanese during the colonial period, all their descendants, like Park Chung-hee. He was actually a military officer serving in the Japanese military in Manchuria. And the whole actually Korean military was dominated by these colonial officers of the Japanese military. So in Korea, it was actually very severely divided between the right and left. The right was pro-Japanese, in fact, or pro-American. And but because and the left that had been put into prison for a long time. But they have to, like Fanon, and Franz Fanon has well, very famously, characterized the national bourgeoisie as having a Janus face. When they're facing their own population, they are anti-colonial. When they turn around, they like be really socialized with their former colonial masters, playing golf and drinking gasoil and all that, and the kids mingle together. So in Korea, it's the same thing. The situation changed until 1996 when Kim Dae-jung became president, who was in prison for a long time. And they started to form this called Committee for Settling Accounts with anti-Korean behaviors. And then the right-wing people were really scared. So they started to rebuild this revisionist historiography, trying to clarify the Japanese colonization. But this is the problem with not having interrogated modernity thoroughly enough. What is the problem with modernity? We did not know. We always remember that, modernity has brought us everything possible. So philosophically, we have to really go more radical. Let me just try to end this very fast. So when you said theory is important, I totally agree with you, because and in many cases, in most cases, to do this kind of interrogation, we need theory. For instance, in the case of ecology, we have been, the kind of ecological discourse have been engaged in this glorification of nature, green nature and all that, and forgotten that by doing so, we actually museumized nature. In fact, what we have to do is the environment. What we have to try to protect, to be friendly to is the environment, including ourselves. We were not the outside environment. So then, the contemporary theory of new materialism, which puts the kind of utmost importance on the material agency of things, is very, very important, because then we are able to treat everything as having life. And then we, engage in ecological activities, not because we need to do this to protect us, but because we respect life. And that's a total different way of seeing ecology. And this leads me back to a comparative paradigm, because in Chinese culture, or in many of these tribal culture actually, people treat everything as having like animistic culture, which used to be disparaged as like superstition with us. But in fact, that actually ties in with the kind of idea of material agency very, very well. So why don't we just go back to our traditions to expand on them and then have it provide a kind of a local nutrition to the global culture. I'd just like to end with actually a few words from your article. Yeah. I think this is like encapsulates everything that we've been talking about here. Alan says toward the end of his article, he says that in the end, what is most authentic is not the infinitely reproducible, but the moment of irreducible insight. And that's why we do theory. Because theory enables us to see that, to catch that moment of irreducible insight, a queer intelligibility, which makes possible a form of self-relation and a relation to others that is based on curiosity and care. One that must be informed by data and cosmopolitan in its scope, but is never reducible to information nor globalized in its imperial reach. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's about as nice and receptive a response as one could hope for. I mean, I think I was particularly struck at the end when you were talking about, you know, the way we have to think about the environment. And to me, that is the single most important question we're facing today. I mean, it is something that worries me on a daily basis. You know, I have a son who's 22 years old, and I frankly worry about, you know, what is the world he's going to inherit, you know. But I think crucial to this is that we not see, and this was in your remarks, that we not see the environment as something separate from us. That we not see the world as a collection of objects that are there for our use. And that is a very sort of modern, in quotation marks, way of looking at things. You know, we are subjects and there are objects out there, and we need to manipulate them in such a way that we maximize utility. You know, this is kind of a game theoretical approach to the world. But the flaw in that is it always sees us as not part of the world. It always sees the world as somehow external to us. And you know, to me, the real challenge in global culture today is to see the way in which we are embedded in the world, in our traditions, and you know, those traditions are what make life interesting and important. I think one of the converses of the neoliberal model and this kind of globalism is it has led, I believe, actually to the rise in fundamentalism. You know, because as the world that we live is increasingly evacuated from meaning, as things are reduced to a series of ones and zeros, you know, people can't live that way. You know, I was talking to the vice president at National Taiwan University of the Arts yesterday, and she's an engineer, and she worked for a long time on creativity with engineers. And one of the things she found is that she could not explain to many of her colleagues why they were doing this, because they couldn't explain how it was useful, because they only understood utility in this very narrow sense of something that could be quantified and eventually monetized. And, you know, the converse of that is, so if that's all the meaning that exists in your life world, but people don't actually live like that, people tend to assert meaning in absolute terms, you know? So, you know, my life is meaningful because God told me this, you know, because I read this book and it said things have to be this way, you know. And we see that increasingly. We see that in the United States. We see that in, we certainly see that in the Islamic world. And these are attempts, absolutely, we see it in India today, actually, with the rise of Hindu fundamentalism. You know, these are attempts in the face of modernity's loss of meaning to assert meaning in an absolutist way as opposed to a dialogical way, a collaborative way, an open way. You know? And you know, I think that's particularly dangerous. You know? But thank you very much.
Should we open it up to the audience?
Yeah, I think like since we still have 30 minutes, I think basically today we have digested a lot, you know, theory, comparative literature, comparative lives, globalism, dialogue, environment, insects' life, humans' life, and so I hope like this, the open floor will be more like so. Like now it's open to the audience, and so please just feel free to share, to critique, to comment on what you have in mind, and hopefully it's going to be instructive.
I've studied Irish literature in particular William of Yeats. He was Irish, but he is also English scholar. So he was in a very delicate situation. He is for Ireland on the one hand. On the other hand, he is also pro England and things like that. So from that delicate position, literature, great literature, originated, I think. And from this, I think we can learn that we say these days there are globalism or imperialism, post-colonialism, and all kinds of things. They are the originates from the one single thing, nationalism, basically, nationalism. That is the biggest problem, I think. But paradoxically, nationalism is very important. I see a lot of good assumptions there. The recognition of the existence of parallel worlds. Everything is parallel, right? It's democracy, democratic. But if it's democratic, everything is single, what could we tell from good things, bad thing from good thing from bad thing? Then certainly there are good things, bad things, right? Good literature, highly developed literature, and less developed literature, and things like that. So we have to balance those things, right? We have to study very hard, which is good, which is bad, and which is good for humanity. And that's my point. And another thing is, in the assumptions, nature is excluded. I think nature is the key point. Human beings are part of the world, right? We have to recognize nature. Also, I think we have to believe in the development of science, because all kinds of words broke out because of the expansion of territory, right? The natural resources or energies or things like that. But those problems will be solved eventually. So we have to concentrate to educate people, make people good, right? Make people not egotistic, things like that. If we ignore these things, the earth will be perished. Maybe in 50 years, in 100 years, it'll disappear. So that's my points, 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Reed. Professor Liang, any response to that comment?
Well, I certainly didn't want to give the impression that I had excluded nature from my assumptions, although I think nature is, I admit, is a problematic category because we tend to see nature as something that is out there as opposed to something that we are part of and inside of. And so, you know, if you look at the history of the word nature, it has meant many different things over many centuries. And often it has been a kind of normative term that has been used oppressively. You know, I mean, you think particularly in terms of sexual minorities. You know, acts against nature. You know, what is natural behavior? You know, women are naturally subordinate to men. You know, these are the kinds of things that, you know, nature as an abstraction has been used for. So I guess you may be right, I am a little uncomfortable with the term, but I'm certainly not uncomfortable with the notion that we have to live within the confines of a world system, a global system that will continue on without us if we manage to not respect what its parameters are. And if we want to call that nature, you know, I'm fine with that, but it's not a neutral term. It is one that needs to be interrogated.
Well, I think the problem with the idea of nature in the ecological discourses is that they're actually, like Eleanor also mentioned, nature was excluded from the human kind of living space. So we have to adore nature, protect nature, etc. But nature just keeps receding from us because that's the wrong approach. We have to include everything as the realm of our ecological engagement. That way, nature would be, the green nature would be, automatically protected. But if we, on one hand, turn nature into national parks and all that, on the other hand, we're drinking bottled water, then we are destroying nature. So we simply museumize them, turn nature into a museum, where we just venture into once in a while to get refreshed. But nature will be gone sooner than we would expect. That's one thing. But that's why, Ellen used a very good term, that we have to recognize the fact that we are embedded in nature. So we are part of nature too. The environment is part of nature too. There's no divide between nature and culture. That's one thing. And another thing about, as a response to your comment on nationalism, I completely agree with you. Nationalism nowadays has become not merely nowadays, but I think it has been a problem since the rise of nation state. The belief that one nation, one state. So one state can only have one nation. And therefore the minorities have to be assimilated or cleansed. Or like the case of Ottoman, the end of Ottoman Empire, where they started to cleanse the Armenians, or Hitler tried to cleanse the Jews because they just believe that these people don't fit. Not only they don't fit, they actually is undermining the nation. Actually, I just saw the film called Farewell to Europe, Stefan Zweig, Farewell to Europe. It's about an very famous Austrian Jewish novelist called Stefan Zweig. In Taiwan, I think people know his works, such as 一个陌生女子来信 or 同情的罪 a letter from an unknown woman, and Beware of Pity. And he is one of the Jews in Europe, very often they would commit themselves to these very idealistic visions such as anarchism, communism, and internationalism, pacifism. And Zweig just brought up this figure, these kind of very idealistic Jews, because the Jews have been oppressed in Europe for a long time, and so they were often the first to support this kind of emerging idealistic faith. And in that movie, Stefan Zweig, even under the kind of shadow of Nazism, he insisted that he wants to be a European. He wants to be a pacifist. He doesn't want to be limited to one nation. He believes in Europe. He believes in peace. Even though, of course, he was considered by many as coward, even by, for instance, the film journalist from New York who was Jewish. He wanted him to condemn Hitler, and he refrained from doing that because of his pacifist faith. Of course, this is controversial. But on the other hand, the ability to look far enough toward a vision which is more comprehensive, more congenial to a idealistic vision. I think that's the kind of ability we have to cultivate. And just one last thing. Zweig in the movie says, I think he says in his real life too, he says that, Erasmus, he wrote a book called Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus was the first considered, according to him, first European, because he was trying very hard in his lifetime to bridge the gap between Catholicism and burgeoning Protestantism, believing that unifying everybody would be better than dividing, Europe into the two segments. And even though people like us who believe in peace should remember him, the first European, even though he failed. And he believes that in the future, the passports, borders will eventually become history, and Europe will be born, even though it probably would be too late for us to see that.
Great. Further comments, questions? Yeah, Professor Khan.
Thanks, Professor Miller and Professor Liao. This is really stimulating and at the same time really comprehensive idea, big picture about the theory and abstraction and things like that. And especially I really like Professor Miller's idea about the importance of theory, significance of theory which is really important for thinking about this global situation and everything else that happens around us. But I'm really curious, and I really completely agree with you. And I'm an Americanist and literature guy, but I'm really interested in studying and analyzing and thinking about theory in general. And I just completed my first book on Freud, so it's been 2 weeks or something like that. But this is, unfortunately, it's in Korean, so you cannot read it, otherwise in translation. So I completely agree with you, and I think that the theory right now becomes, for me, I think this becomes sort of lingua franca among the academics and even the public people. You can use every kind of theoretical concept and idioms in everyday life, and you can communicate even if you do not know the language of the scholars around the world, but you can talk at some kind of concept and idioms like biopolitics, right? So I think that the theory is really important for communicating and engaging also with other people around the world and thinking about this task and missions for us to face it. But I'm just wondering. My question is about what kind of there's a lot of theories. You know that, right? Yeah. And when you talk about when you are doing the theory, generally you think about I'm a Foucauldian, I'm a Derridian, I'm a delusion, and things like that. So there is this certain tendency to comprehensively connect ourselves by this theory, but at the same time there is this strong tendency to compartmentalization, this division of theories in individual ways. So I'm wondering what you think that what kind of theories that we really need, what kind of theoretical perspective you really need in order to think about this whole kind of things. Thank you.
So I'm not going to answer your question, or at least not directly. Because I think it'd be really wrong for me to sit up here and go, oh, well, you need to use this theory, And instead, I'm going to tell you about a couple of books I wrote. But I've written 2 books on French philosophers reading Plato. One on Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault, and one on Irigaray, Kristeva, and Sarah Kaufman. And it was originally going to be one book, and it just got too big, and so it split into 2. And the reason I bring this up is these are people who are generally thought of as theorists. Although I would point out that Foucault and Derrida never called themselves theorists, they called themselves philosophers. and Lacan, thought he was training psychoanalysts. But what happens is we compartmentalize theory. You're right, people say, I'm a Deleuzian, I'm a Derridian. And I think that's very problematic. So one of the reasons I wrote those books was, it seemed to me that these people were, rather than sitting in their offices and creating theories, they were in fact engaged in a conversation with each other. And so Plato was kind of a way into that conversation. Plus I also just like Plato. But they were having these debates, and you could see, that Lacan would do a reading of the Symposium, and then Derrida would come back, and then Foucault would come back, and they keep coming back to these texts. And so, yes, they disagreed, but they were not necessarily creating these edifices that were theories that you would then apply. And that's the way theory often gets taught. You have your mandatory graduate theory seminar, and 1 week you're learning deconstruction, and the next week you're learning Marxism, and then you have a paper where you're told to take one of these theories and apply it to a poem. And I think that's just all wrong. I understand why we do it, because you have to start somewhere, and people oftentimes don't know much because they don't have the philosophical background to really do this, and that would have been true of me too when I was first starting out. But I really think that what we have to understand is, A, theory is not something you can escape, and B, theory is not a thing. So you're not, people who say that they are a Foucauldian and don't read other people, Foucault would think you were stupid. But Foucault didn't do that. He read lots of things. The same with Derrida. One of the fascinating things about Freud is, Freud is engaged with all sorts of different thinkers. I mean, he's clearly been reading Nietzsche. He's clearly, even when he denies it, he's clearly been reading Schopenhauer. He's clearly deeply read in the classics. And so, these are people who are picking up on conversations that go back 100 years, 1,000 years, etc. And I think recapturing that conversation as part of what we naturally do, oops, there's that natural word, but as part of what we do as thinking beings is important. So I'm resistant to the idea that there is a theory or a set of theories that you should adopt. Rather, what I think you should do is theorize. Think deeply about your assumptions, read widely, and engage in that conversation.
Other questions? We still have about 10 minutes, so enough time for it.
Just suck the air right out of it.
Maybe.
Alan was actually telling the interested contributors about the methodology. So
I thank you for your stimulating talk and Professor Liao's commentaries back receiving all these talks. One quick question is about, is there, in the book, Professor Miller mentions about going beyond neoliberalistic ways of thinking, but I'm wondering, is there another stage that's been approached that would go towards certain kind of new idealistic ways of understanding the world? And second thing is about this publication, since the title is Digitalizing Global Text, is this text being digitalized?
And just, for complete honesty and transparency, Peru was my student many years ago, so, and it's wonderful to see her here. I don't know whether it's being digitalized, but we have the Associate Director of the Press sitting right here, so digitalized? He recorded it.
To me, the answer is still I don't know, but I would like to have it be digitalized.
And then I'm going to be real brief on what I think is the beyond of neoliberalism, because, again, I don't want to prescribe per se, but one of the things that I've been really thinking about the last 10, 15 years is a concept that I'm calling unrepeatable knowledge, because it seems to me that one of the things that neoliberalism really emphasizes in a higher education field is repeatability. And if you look at the kind of assessment we're supposed to do, you know, everything's supposed to be repeatable. I actually think that in the humanities, that's fundamentally wrong. If I ask you and you and you to read a poem in my class, and you each come up with the exact same thing, then I have failed as a professor. Now, in a chemistry laboratory, if we're doing the same experiment and you each come up with 3 different things, then I've also failed. You know, so there's something fundamentally different I want to claim about humanistic knowledge, which is, I would argue, resistant to this kind of neoliberal homogenization.
Well, let me add one thing from our tradition. The idea that everything is life is going beyond, one of the ways of going beyond neoliberal, like Alan already mentioned. The neoliberal order treats everything as resources for us to consume. So that easily leads to our abusing all these resources. Now, resources are disposable, but they are not resources, they are life. And we can see this in, for instance, the traditional Chinese Taoist thinking, which is an important alternative to Confucianism. So in fact, in China, it's at least these, including also Buddhism, these 3 are intertwining and constantly negotiating with each other. So the Confucian order is predominant in political realm, but in arts, it's predominantly Buddhist, Zenist Buddhist, and Taoist. So in Taoist thinking, everything is life, everything's equal. In, for instance, the Taiwanese Aboriginal ways of living, the Dao people on Orchid Island, when they felled a tree to make a bed for their to make a marriage bed, wedding bed, they would have to pray to the tree. They have to go through this ritual of praying to the tree, explaining to the tree why they are felling, chopping it off, because they need it to be the wedding bed, and from now on they can share life together. The bed can witness their making love and bearing children and all that. Only after having done that can they fell the tree. So they treat life as equal. I mean, the tree as equal to them. But these have all been swept into the dustbin of history because of capitalism, and on which the neoliberal order has been enhanced. So I think it's on the one hand very difficult, because you're so used to drinking bottled water, so it's very difficult. But on the other hand, it's so easy, just a change of mind, a change of vision, and you see ways, not only just one way, ways of going beyond the liberal order. You just have to work hard. You just have to fast your mind, as we say in Taoism. Fast your mind, cleanse your mind of all these secular desires. Then you would have a much better life. Life without capitalist commodities.
So we have any comments from grad students? In particular, I think yes, the lady there.
Hi, I'm a student here in the MA program for Languages and Literatures, and after listening to the talk, it just reminds me of something that I heard from my fellow students in the program in the past year. is that I think a lot of us in this like academic setting, in this academic system, some students who have this sort of I don't know, this wish to sort of change society or to react against the problems of neoliberalism or inequality or all those problems brought by this trend of globalization, is that they feel that by staying in this academic setting, the things that they can do is very limited, and they're sort of frustrated by, how much theory can actually bring change to society, or how much as a scholar they can actually contribute to like social change and all that. So I was just wondering, like, how would you sort of respond to this sort of anxiety among the students who have this vision for the future? Yeah, thank you.
Well, I certainly think that if you have meaningful political work that you know you should be out doing, you should probably go out and do it. But I think what we do in the academy is actually really important. Okay, so I mean, when you teach your students, you change their lives. I know my life was changed by my teachers. I wouldn't be who I am today. I wouldn't understand the world the way I do today if it wasn't for my teachers. So I think teaching is actually a really important service that you can render your community. Again, not to say that, if you see that you can go out and you can immediately take over the government, maybe you should do that, But most of us don't really have that opportunity. And what we think of as useful life means going and getting some kind of job and kind of figuring out, how you're going to get by day to day. And I'm not to say that that's more meaningful than actually teaching people. I'm not sure I buy that. I also think that our writing is important. I mean, scholarly writing is a little like putting a message in a bottle and you're throwing it in the ocean. You don't really know what's going to happen to it. I mean, you publish an article, you hope somebody reads it. Hopefully somebody will read this book. I know at least one person has. But, it's an act of faith, because you don't know. But if you do enough of it over time, people do read it. And not only do they then think about what you've done, but that then affects the way they teach their students. So you can actually affect thousands of people's lives, maybe not all directly, but frequently indirectly, by teaching and affecting the way other people teach. And that changes the discourse and allows people, to think differently and to be differently. And I kind of think that's important.
Can I just say something? Yeah. Let me just quote Stefan's life again in the movie. Because that movie just really kind of haunts me quite a bit. Because, in the movie he was confronted with the question of condemning Germany at the time, because Germany is preparing for war. And he said, I don't want to be radical, because as an intellectual, I don't want to go down to the level of our opponent first. And then he says, as a writer, our job, or a theorist, a professor, an academician, our job is not to betray language, nuanced language, with slogans. I think in the ordinary times it's a lot easier to do this, but at times of crisis, especially national crisis, it's very easy for the intellectual to go down to the level of the mob. Like just throwing out the simplistic black and white slogans, which just, blinds the masses. Because you have the power, you have the intellectual power, people respect you, and you say them, and people believe you. So at this moment, at times of crisis especially, I think the responsibility of the intellectual is to go against the grain. You know, to use nuanced language to keep people from becoming too simplistic or simple-minded. Then, you know, because simple-mindedness will divide the society itself. It would not really, you know, add to your power of resisting the enemy, but it would weaken yourself because it immediately divides the society itself. And so, going against the grain and use radical. You have to be radical, but radical in the sense of thorough, of being nuanced. And we have the responsibility to keep, you know, the kind of popular sentiments in check. That's what I was trying to do.
Unfortunately, our time is almost up, and we are truly honored to have Alan today. Actually, his schedule is truly packed. Later on, he's going to another university to give another talk, and we really appreciate him squeezing his time for this very important talk. Oh yeah, okay. And then also today, I think here we are not here to solve problems, but I think that from the dialogue we know we are here to be aware of these changes. And as humanities scholars or as professors, students in this academic community, I think Professor Liao's concluding words, I think I totally agree that we do need nuanced vocabulary to articulate these changes, and so that the dialogue can go on. And so here today we thank Professor Miller, Professor Liao, and Professor Zhang for the wonderful conversation, and I hope you can later join us for further discussions. Thank you very much. We have some gift exchange.
So we have a souvenir from the NTU Press, and through the inspiration from the dialogue, I find that this souvenir, which is fountain pen, I think is a good encounter of the West, because fountain pen is from the Western world. I think it was invented by the Western people. But the package is very much from the Taiwan University, which is from the East. So it's a good encounter from the East and West. Okay, so I would like to deliver the souvenir to Professor Miller on behalf of our director, Wang Taishen. Thank you very much. Okay, let me show. No, we have. Okay.
Here we go. Maybe a group photo together.